Diane, I hope, is willing to take some questions.
Absolutely. I've kept you longer than you probably wanted, so, but I'm happy. I went through it awfully fast.
And your name is?
Hello, my name's Diane Freeman. I was wondering, another feature of professional development I've personally found quite useful about being a teacher is going back to be a learner. Particularly, say, for language teachers, maybe learning a new language, maybe once every 5 years or something, but I was wondering
Yeah,
if you
no,
had
I
to
think
comment on that.
that's a great idea. We have a shock language experience at the outset to give people for just 1 week. They're learners in a language they haven't learned before. It's, and there's no talk of teaching. There's a talk about how are you as a learner? What was that experience like? Can you get in touch with the affect that that's all about, right? And we do that as a platform from which we then, it becomes a touchstone as they then think about teaching, to go back to their experience as learners and to hear about the experience of other students, because not everybody has this common experience, do they? No, I think that's really important. You know, you might do a more abbreviated fashion of it, but going back, well, I mean, you know, I think that's right, but I was just going to say, almost learning anything and being a reflective practitioner is going to help you as a teacher, but certainly something like learning a language.
Specifically for language, it might be an obvious route.
Yes,
to say,
yes.
But I would argue just go back and learn anything.
Yes.
Because
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Remember what it's like not to understand.
That's right. That's right.
It's not about being stupid, it's about not
That's
knowing.
right. And we're so afraid, I think, well, I'm using the royal we, I guess, but we're so afraid we're going to bore our students, you know, because we find it so easy. And so getting in touch with the fact that it isn't so easy is very helpful. I think it's particularly helpful if we focus on what it's like to be a learner, as opposed to judging the instruction that we're receiving, right? If you can maintain that focus, I think it's very much, it's a real contributor, as you say, to your ongoing development. Thanks for the suggestion. Other questions or comments?
Dan, you mentioned the standardization and accountability, and with kind of the way that a lot of organizations or gatekeepers are managing this
Yes.
kind of thing, how do you think teachers or organizations can interact to kind of reduce?
Yeah, it's a real
process?
problem, as I said. One of the hallmarks of American education heretofore has been the lack of that. I mean, you might say that's a problem, and in some ways it is, because no child left behind meant before that there were children left behind. But the idea was there was creativity, there was an open-endedness to it. And we didn't have those, you know, leaving exams that you've had, and many countries of the world have. The exit exams I'm talking about, or the, what, I don't know what you call them collectively, the standardized exams. And now we do. And of course, what do you get? You get what's called near transfer. You get teachers teaching for the test. Why? Well, especially if your paycheck and your livelihood is going to be judged on how well your students do, but also their livelihood, their potential for success is going to be judged on how well they do. So there's a benevolent aspect to it. That's what you wind up doing. And that's very unfortunate, because that's a near transfer when we should be teaching for a far transfer, right? For them to take what they're learning in the classroom and be able to use it for their own purposes elsewhere and at other times. So it seems to me that's a real problem. Teachers' organizations have taken stances on this. I told you about the Chicago, well, that was a union taking a stand, and they were successful, by the way. They no longer will be, it won't be their sole judge of teacher quality, won't be the students' performance on standardized tests. But it's coming, and it's coming pretty rapidly. And the bureaucrats, you know, make that connection. Well, you know, if you're a good teacher, your students are going to perform well. If you're not a good teacher, they won't. They don't see the simplicity of that and the era of that way of thinking. But teachers, you know, the TESOL, I'm going to be speaking at TESOL next March on my view of language, which is that it's a dynamic system and how that's in direct conflict with a test that's multiple choice and looking for discrete items of correct whatever, grammar or vocabulary, and how different that is. I think we have to do that. I sometimes hesitate to talk about this because, golly, I think we just keep putting more and more on teachers. You know, not only do you have to be an effective teacher and manager of your classroom, and participant in a professional discourse community, but now and an advocate for your students, but now you have to be an advocate for yourself as well. But you might want to read Mark Clark's book, A Place to Stand, because he says, you know, we have to do this. We have to say, this is where I will stand. And that part of that is resisting the forces that are beyond the teachers, but have huge impact and huge implications for how we conduct what we do and what we are so committed to doing. So I don't know if that's an answer. I think we have to do it. I hesitate to do that because we academics got our busyness, and teachers, and I'm a teacher, we have our busyness. You know, it's hard to say, and by the way, here's another thing, and by the way, here's another thing. But maybe that's what we need, you know, these developing teacher idea, because it's people who are feeling a little more comfortable in their role of teachers perhaps could be the best spokespeople. The thing is, we're not good at it. We actually had a training session at the School of Education at the University of Michigan on how to talk to the press. Because how do you talk about education? How many words did I use this morning? I mean, I'm not good at these sound bites for education, you know. It's very hard to explain the complexities of teaching and learning in a soundbite that a bureaucrat or the public will understand. The other thing we have going against us is that all of the people who vote and pay taxes and all were students at one time. And from a student perspective, it doesn't look all that difficult, maybe, because you don't have access to what's going on, the thinking and planning and strategizing that's going on in the teacher's mind. Now, do I stop now, even though they don't all have it? Do I move on to the next one? At what point do I consider it learned? Is it time for a break? Oh, golly, so that student in the corner hasn't said anything. Maybe I need to check in with that student. You know, right? The moment by moment complexity of teaching. As a student, if you've never been a teacher, you haven't had access to that. You've only seen what the teacher did, which is why I think, and this is a stage, I think this is a stage, why when our teacher trainees first begin, what's their preoccupation? Well, my observation is their preoccupation is with themselves, because they're neophytes. They have to learn those routines, but also because they haven't had access to what was really going on internally for their teachers. They only saw the performance. So what do? They perform, and until they get comfortable with that, I understand that. Can you start to stand? I think that's partly reflected in some of these stages. Can you stand back, reflect, and go on? So I think the complexity of what we do is something that argues or makes it difficult for us to convince the funders of what we do, the taxpayers or the private investors or whomever is the stakeholder, that it's much more complex than just looking at the results of a standardized exam. See, no reporter would have stood for me to say all of that. You were nodding throughout, but no reporter would have stood for that. Or if they would, I wouldn't want to read what came out in the article afterwards.
You commented on the perhaps unhelpfulness of sort of global or contextless sort of standards and sort of hoops to jump through, or however you want to call them. But looking at a specific context, is that context, is it enough to look at a single organisation? For example, IH London, is that one context, and therefore is it the role of the organisation of IH London to come up with or suggest or impose a sort of level of standards, or is this sort of community of learners always going to be sort of bottom up? Is it always going to be grassroots level? And how do you sort of balance between perhaps the needs of an organisation versus the needs of a staff?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So if learning takes place in context, I mean, this is sort of what I was talking about earlier when I said, how can we prepare our students for the multiple contexts that the diverse group will experience, but even a single teacher might experience across his or her professional lifespan? How do we prepare for that when teaching and learning is context dependent, I think? And I think the way at that is to teach for a context. I mean, I think the IH way makes sense. what we did at SIT is we moved the internship, the teaching practicum, to a more central place and had students prepare for where they were going to do the teaching. But that's SIT. Coming back here, I think you do have to prepare for a context and this, or to follow a set of guidelines. You can't prepare for everything. But I think it's also I would say a necessity, certainly desirable feature of a training program to help people understand how to adapt to another context. I mean, there is a vast literature on adaptation. How do you get people to adapt? Why not? Why not help somebody to develop a repertoire of activity, particularly at the CELTA level, when they have to go in and do something that they have not had a lot of experience doing. But maybe at the Delta level, or maybe even at the CELTA level, working on them, how do you adapt? Now what happens if you have to teach in this environment or that environment? Or what happens if technology is part of it? What do you do then? I think these sort of hypothetical statements, or even experience adaptation. When I talk about language teaching, I think something very helpful is long ago, Earl Stevick wrote about technemes. And techneme is a combination, is a portmanteau between technique and phoneme. So it's a technique that has a meaningful difference, makes a meaningful difference. That's the idea. So he took tech from technique, eme from phoneme or morpheme, put them together, created this portmanteau that says, basically what it says is, when you're teaching and you're using a particular technique, the problem is often that your students who are faster are finished, the students who are slower still need more practice, right? I mean, that's a universal. We all cope with multiple levels, multiple rates of learning in our classroom. So he says, what you have to do is you have to take a technique, I'll get you in a second. You have to take a technique and you have to just change it a little bit. Change it a little bit. And that little bit of change renews the interest, in theory, of those who have already finished the activity or technique or don't need to learn it, and gives more practice to those who still do. I think it's a very important, I use it in my teacher training all the time. How could you do that? How could you change it a little bit? How could you renew the challenge? Because teaching's nothing if it's not managing energy. And if the energy wanes, flags, you're not going to get much learning to take place. I think you can teach adaptation by changing it a little bit, changing it a little bit, changing a little bit, and the students have to adapt to the new condition. So say what you just said, say it faster. Say what you just said, I don't know, but add another sentence. Remember that picture, close your eyes and describe it. You know, just change the conditions a little bit. I think that same idea of techneme could be used with teaching. You've just done that activity, how could you change it a little bit? Change it a little bit. You know, we go in with our huge suitcases or valises of activities, and we think we have to have 3 or 4 or 5 different major activities in a lesson depending on its length. Maybe we don't. Maybe we just need 1 or 2, and then we need to give new practice, or at least over time, new practice by coming back to that same activity and changing it a little bit. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think you do have to deal with the context at hand, but I think you can complement that by teaching adaptation.
Development of teachers, do you think that an organization should take that sort of that responsibility for pushing that forward?
If you can't adapt to technology, if you can't understand this new phenomenon that's going to become more and more central to the way in which we work, you're in trouble, I think. So you have to learn how to do that. You have to learn adaptation. I don't have all the answers, but that's one of the ones I think it's really important. And we overlook that. We just assume that our trainees can adapt and become educators. You know, just as we assume when we say get into a group that everybody's going to be on task or they're going to know how to work socially together. I don't think we should assume any of that. I think we should teach it. There was a question or comment here. Thank you for yours.
And just really a comment about the reference to John Hattie's work, that it's entirely based on what makes students learn faster and the international evidence for it. And it's been sort of distilled into a very easy way for new teachers and teachers who haven't got an awful lot of time by Jeff Petty on evidence-based teaching. And basically, it talks about the top 10 techniques for increasing student attainment, and it's really easy to adapt to language teaching. So if anybody wants a very quick and accessible way of assessing their use of teaching techniques and what goes on in the classroom, it's a great read.
So thank you for adding to what I was talking about with John Hattie's work, and I agree with that. I do think, though, this is my own prejudice. Well, first of all, I think IH does some of that. For example, I was looking at the website here, and the people commenting on their experience as trainers, and they were saying, and trainees, and they were saying, for example, that feedback, I said that was one of the top winners in his review. They were saying feedback was really important, and on the IH website, they said we try to give students abundant feedback. So I think a lot of that is not commonsensical, but kind of common practice. The only problem I have is, and it's worth a read. I wouldn't have called attention to it if I didn't think so. But when you say these are the top 10 or these are the top 5 or whatever, then you're working to the mode. And I want to always remember that we have responsibility for all our trainees or all our students. And they might not all learn that way, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't practice good teaching and the 10 best techniques, but you always want to be aware of the variety and the diversity of individual human being. It wouldn't be relevant, although I almost included them in my talk today, but I have some wonderful graphs from looking at language learning where you see the average performance of the class, and it looks nice and ascending, nice linear line. They're learning over time. If you can imagine, time is on the horizontal axis and the vertical axis is proficiency, and they're learning over time, or it doesn't mean proficiency necessarily, it could be more granular, something like accuracy or vocabulary complexity. Looks really nice. And then you go down one level of granularity to the individuals, and what do you see? You see spaghetti, right? You see them all over the place, such that even some of them actually do poorer at the end of the course on a particular feature than what they started out with. I mean, at least on the measures that were used in the study I conducted. So I'm not disputing anything, but I think we need to be really careful that we don't say, right, I got those 10 down, and in the meantime, perhaps, it's all based on research, which isn't bad, but I think that we want to acknowledge the individuality and diversity of our students and our teachers.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed very much what I was here for. I'm just very interested in helping myself to manage the expectation of our learners. I think when we were talking about taxpayers and voters,
When you're talking about, sorry?
Taxpayers and voters who all know about teaching, I think satisfying the expectation is so important, and finding out what that is almost the key issue.
You're talking about the trainees or the students? Well,
Training teachers to do that.
absolutely. Well, I always tell my own trainees, it's not teaching if what you're teaching they already know. I mean, that's the teaching is subordinated to learning. So what is the first thing you need to do? Find out what they know. And that sounds so simple, but most people will go in, a lot of teachers will go in and say, right, today we're doing present perfect. And by the way, I'm not anti-grammar by any means, but we're going to do kinship terms, or we're going to do reading passage, or, it doesn't have to be grammar. Well, why not find out if they know that, right? You're not teaching if they already know it. So I think that's really critical. What they know, who they are, all the things I was ticking off before about trainees, their apprenticeship of observation, all of that. And yes, I also think the expectations of our students for a model of good teaching is also important to understand, because if you're going to be a facilitator to students who are expecting you to be an authority, using these words rather loosely, you probably will have some resistance and maybe not even some very successful learning going on. So not only knowing what they know about the subject matter, but what are their expectations, as you so well put it, that they expect of you as a teacher. Now, what happens if they expect an authority, and I mean by authority a teacher-centered classroom, when your predilection is to be more peer learning or facilitator of group work and that sort of thing? I think if you start with the group work from day one, you may have some problems. You know, I mean, I think you need to teach those dynamics just as you teach the content. You need to help people learn how to learn in a different way. It sounds complicated, and all I'm doing is adding more and more responsibility. But my sense is that that's a much more effective way in the long run than if you start out thinking, I'm going to do group work today, when that isn't something that students like or understand or feel is helpful. I mean, how many times have you been told, I can't learn from my other students, they make mistakes, you know, that kind of thing? And helping them to see that's not what it's all about. So I don't know if that's what you meant by expectations, but the expectations of the teacher, the expectations, I spend time talking about the learning process with my language students. And I talk about language too, because they want to know what's right in English, and what's the right answer? Everybody wants that security, and I understand that. If you're going to say there's more than one answer, there's more than one dialect, there's more than one variety of English, you have to do that in a way that maintains the security of your students. So everybody wants to know what's the right answer. But I think they need to know about language, and if you can get them to reflect on their own language. Well, is there only one way of saying that in your language? You know, you can start to open eyes about how language works. And it's not postponing. I mean, I'm not talking about, you know, a 3-day linguistics lecture. I'm just talking about a way of introducing it. When I teach grammar, which I do, I teach a grammar course, English for academic purposes grammar course, at the University of Michigan, not every year, but pretty regularly. Now, these students are placed in the grammar course. They tend to be graduate students. The University of Michigan. Do you think they want to be there? Oh, no, no way. They've studied grammar for how many years, and their English is good, and they're great students. But they don't want to know about grammar. So I start out talking about grammar. What is grammar? Let's look at what grammar is. Grammar is polysemous. Let's see if we can understand what we're trying to do. And I have a pie chart that I think maybe IH uses, I'm not sure, my 15 minutes of fame, where I try to show grammar is about form, but it's also about meaning and use, and the use is the pragmatics. When you have a choice, which form do you use? How do you pay attention to contextual appropriateness, or not pay attention to it because you want to be bold and daring and assertive? So I teach them what I call the grammar of choice. I get them to understand why you use the passive versus the active, or when you use past tense versus present perfect, which is a problem in American English especially, or any number of things. And the articles, when do you use a definite article versus an indefinite article? No one has explained that to them. I mean, we tried, and I admit that one's a little harder than some of the others. But I talk about teaching reasons rather than rules. So I actually start out with a little mini, what would you call it? It's not a lecture necessarily, but a frame for helping them to understand what we're going to work on. I don't know that I'm the world's best grammar teacher, but I do know that the student's attitude shifts. I do know that, because they say, oh yeah, that is, I do have that problem. You know, I know about the passive, I know how to form the passive, but I don't know exactly when to use it, or when to use the middle voice, or how to start out a research paper, or why the methods section is written in a different voice or a different tense than the analysis of the data, right? Because these are grad students, so they're doing a lot of research work. And so that seems to help too. So why not? Why should we keep these things secret? Why not get our learners on our side so they understand why I'm asking them to work in a certain way?
Let's imagine like you were asked to be a consultant and you were talking to a manager of an institution or school, and they were thinking, well, of bringing in some kind of descriptors or criteria for teacher development on that kind of linear manner. What advice would you give to them?
You know, we have to have some way of looking at experienced teachers. It's not just one big morass, you know. But I guess what I would say to a manager is find out what your teachers want to know. Find out what they know and what they don't know, what they want to know. Don't rely on stages of development. Find out what questions they have. Why not start there? You know, second language acquisition, which I also teach, although I don't call it that anymore, I call it second language development. I'm trying to sanitize my lexicon. Because acquisition has a very different meaning, connotation than development. Acquisition is something you hold on to and it's done, right? Anyway, when I teach that course, I haven't always done this, I confess, but one of the things that I've said I'm always learning, one of the things that I'm embarrassed to tell you, this is sort of a recent awareness, and I haven't really implemented it fully. So in truth and advertising here, I'm telling you something that I'm interested in doing that I haven't done, but I'm going to do. I promise. And if you have me back for another anniversary, I'll tell you about it. Which is to organize my course, my second language acquisition course, around teachers' questions, rather than talking about the research trajectory. But what about because the problem is you talk about the research trajectory and methods of research and the history of the field, all that's part of the professional discourse. I wouldn't want to obviate it. But then we who teach second language acquisition gnash our teeth and say, well, but they're not using this. They don't see the relevance. Well, if they don't see the relevance, maybe start with what's relevant. What do the teachers want to know about learning? And also, at least theory is a great way to nominate topics for a research agenda, because there may be questions that arise that we don't know. So if a manager came to me and said, what would you want for this? I would find out what the teachers want. That's what I would find out. And I wouldn't rely on average anything. And it may not be that teachers all want the same thing, but then you have, then you try to find either something more abstract that addresses, I guess abstract's this way, more abstract that addresses some of them, or, you have a continuing program of development that's laid out before you, although I would always recheck and say, is this still of interest? I didn't mean that as a cop-out answer, but I really think that's important. It's paying attention to the individual. It's starting where they are starting. And I don't know any better way or any better bit of advice for any teacher than to start with your students and what their learning needs, desires are. That's, I think, the essence of good teaching, is meeting the learners where they are. Yes?
Okay, thank you very much. Just two points before we leave. Diane may not know that International House London's links with SIT go a bit further than they did last year, and further than Susan, because this year we've forged links with UCC in Daegu, Korea, whose teachers are trained by SIT in the initial stages, and then since this year they've been coming to London to finish their training with us. Yeah. So there's a unique partnership there.
Let's hope it continues.
Right, thank you. And if after today you find your Saturday mornings strangely empty, can I suggest you look in the 2013 brochure, because next spring we launch a new series of workshops on Saturday mornings, 4 Saturdays in spring, 4 Saturdays in autumn, called TESOL Updates. So do have a look at that and tell your friends about it. Okay, all that remains for me to say is, again, thank you so much, Diane. She has to be back teaching in Michigan on Monday, so we need to let her go. But before we do, can we please